John Outterbridge has long been one of the most interesting people I have ever known. He's a very successful sculptor, poet, musician, and community activist, and sometimes all of those things at the same time. His work has been included in prestigious biennales such as Havana, Cuba, Sao Paulo, Brazil, and Johannesburg in South Africa. John, you were born in North or South Carolina?
North Carolina.
North Carolina.
Mm-hmm. Greenville is the city.
Greenville, North Carolina. Uh-huh. And had your family lived there for generations?
They had, but I think depending on what part of the family. My mother's side of the family were from the Cherokee community of North Carolina. My grandmother was my mother's mother. And then my father's side of the family, they were further east, Baltimore, New York, and he was one of the children that he was sort of orphaned, and so he grew up in another part of the country. And I think because of that, he had a unique courageousness about him and refused in his life to work for anyone but himself. So I grew up hearing his comments and being influenced by a kind of independency and thinking about things. I don't know if it rubbed off on me that much, but I think it did. I never thought about becoming an artist. It was something that was just a natural process. I've always been fond of things, old things especially, and my father was that way. So I might have mimicked his attitude in that regard. He was a man who did not always find himself accepting money when some of the people that he provided service for, when they paid him, if they did not have enough money sometimes, during that time, the 30s, the 40s, my father would accept what they could afford to give him. So many times there was a big truckload of fruit or a truckload of vegetables, corn and stuff like that, and barter. And a funny thing happened in the way that someone paid him, which did influence some of my thinking later on in terms of a ritualistic honor to him and my mother and my grandmother. When I first came into this building here, I felt that before I would do anything in the way of pieces, art, I needed to do a ritual kind of gesture honoring and blessing the space. So I did a tribute to my mother, and I did a tribute to her best friend, who was my father. They grew up together, you know, they were really, really close. And then I did a piece honoring my grandmother, who raised both of them, my mother's mother. And but the piece that came into mind was one day my father was paid for some service that he rendered for a family with a big black and white goat, a big black and white cantankerous goat. And he brought this goat home, and the goat came with a red wagon, and we couldn't get close to him. He was just a mean, bad dude. That's all I could say. And my mother loved animals, we loved animals, but we just can't handle this guy, you know. And my mother really gradually would approach him and try and pet him, but he was tied with a rope and he couldn't go but so far. And she kept telling him, "Now, Billy, we're gonna be the people feeding you, and we're gonna have to get along somewhere. Now, you know we are." He'd charge and you know, and we kept touching him and getting close to him. And every time she did that, we would always be with her. She'd always take us as kids, you know what I mean? And so finally, Billy would eat from us, around us, and after a while he was one of our best friends. So instead of us walking our dog down the street as kids, we had this big black and white beautiful goat. Nobody would dare mess with us either, you know. He had big horns.
Don't mess with
yeah,
me.
I guess it was the male goat. He was a handsome guy. And one of the smaller kids, two of the smaller kids would ride in the wagon. And me or my brother under me, we would be up front just walking Billy. And so when I came here, I did a piece that is owned by one of the museums now. It's in their permanent collection. And it's called First Poet, Olivia, because my mother was quite a poet. And she always introduced you to poems and the importance of listening to music. And she was just that way, you know what I mean? And, but she didn't have to work too hard at that. That was something that we just loved anyway.
When did you arrive in California?
I came to California in 1963. I married in 1960 and came to California in 1963 because I was just curious about what this place was all about. And the first time that I saw a real live palm tree was in Needles, California. I looked at that thing for days, you know. And
And you were just in time for the Watts riots.
Well, 2 years, about a year and a half later, because I came in October of 1963, and I came just before the assassination of President Kennedy, and the streets were very live at that point, and I had not been out of service that long. The civil rights movement was only a few months old when I was discharged from service. And I remember a strange kind of thing, the first day that I traveled in the country after coming back, still in uniform, duffel bags packed for days, and I was coming from New York, and I caught the bus so I could see the countryside and all that, and couldn't afford anything else anyway at that time. And when I got to Richmond, Virginia, I got on a trailway bus in uniform and was ushered to the back of the bus, you know, and I was made out of bricks, boy, well trained and all that. I said, I can blow this damn thing up. But, you know, I got angry and then I got hurt. I thought about all of the guys that I trained with at that time. This is 1955. And I went to the back of the bus and just cracked up. I mean, it really hurt me. And because I left a lot of friends overseas who became just white crosses, you know what I mean? Just great people. And they were brown and they were white and whatever, we all were there, you know, and that's when you really discover that all the blood is red.
When did you become director of the Watchtowers Art Center?
Much later, in 1975, when the city of Los Angeles inherited the site as a gift from the Committee for the Simon Rudia Towers. But before that time, I was very much involved as founder of the Communicative Arts Academy in Compton. That was that's a long story, you know, but that's where I was working without a salary for many years. We put together an institution called the Communicative Arts Academy that was one of the pioneering cultural centers, community cultural centers in the city.
Is that still going on?
No, we lost the building to urban renewal in 1975. And we started from scratch. We built salaries. We got respect from the National Endowment of the Arts. And we thought that art had, that's when we formed the rationale that art was a spiritual kind of vessel that had the audacity to be anything that it needed to be. I started to meet people at that point, like Dwayne Valentine, Richard Serra, Mark DeSuvero, Larry Bell,
Peter Volkas,
John
Mason.
John Mason, you're right, that's it, John Mason, and all of those people. And when Mark DeSuvero, when he got commissions and traveled a lot, he would always leave his tools with me, so that would help me with my work. But a lot of those guys were concerned that we were not showing. We didn't have any place to show, and a lot of them appreciated what we did, but they had the end, right? And you would help a guy like Rothenberg install. You met the work of the great Lyn Kienholz and people like Donald Judd, and they were the same as, they were just energetic individuals, visionaries, you know what I mean? And a lot of our people, like Danny Johnson and the David Hammond, who finally got a Genius grant, and that kind, we were doing all kind of things ourselves, but we didn't have any galleries that accommodated us at that point. I think Joan Ankrum, one of the first people that started to do that kind of thing over on La Cienega, you know. And but I had a great time at working at the museum, because you know, you just ran into a cross section of people. And Richard Serra, one of the wealthiest men in the country, in the world today because of his work, was just an average thinker, artist, when I knew him. And I remember one thing that he said to me one day. We were installing one of his works, and I believe that work had to do with the redwood log piece that he did. In and on the floor of the museum that was right over the vault. And the city engineers in this brand new building were a little shaken up because he had built a concrete template on the floor of the museum, which had a lot of weight about it. And then he's bringing in all these huge redwood logs, and he's going to cut those and put them in place and let them fall in place on the museum floor. And we were on our way downstairs one day to get some more tools that he needed. And as I was riding downstairs with him, I said, "Hey, Richard," I said, "you really have these people shook up, man." I said, how are you going to resolve that? I said, "You're going to have to cut those logs. They're going to fall on the floor." And he says, "You know what? They've got to move that wall too." I said, "That's a brand new wall, man." He says, "They're going to have to knock it out." I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm fucking with them." He says, that's my work. That's what I'm supposed to do. You know what I mean? I never had heard that before, you know. And he said, "That's part of my process."
When you were director of the Watts Towers Art Center, is that when you started the Jazz Festival?
I created the Jazz Festival out of respect for the history and the legacy, long legacy of creativeness and music in that region.
Yeah, like Central Avenue.
Central Avenue, and the great names that grew out of the era and area, like Charlie Mingus and Buddy Collette and Esther Phillips and Johnny Otis and on, Eric Dolphy and
Don Cherry,
and you know, it was a great, just a great legacy there. So I thought that since nothing in the way of a festival had acknowledged that legacy outside of the festival that came into being right after the revolt, which was the Watts Summer Festival. And so I thought that I had an opportunity here, and I didn't have any money. I didn't know where I was going to get resources to do it, but at least I wanted to give some seed to the idea, and that was to introduce a work of art that would be a collective way of thinking about this legacy. And Alonzo Davis at Brockman Gallery, who had in his CETA program people like the young folk who are now known as Hiroshima, you know. And since we didn't have any money, we took all of our friends who were musicians, and they helped us do the first festival. We did it for nothing. We had about $300 a piece or something like that. And we used most of that to pay the musicians. Local 47 gave us a hand with things. And we attracted and seated about 2,000 people. We said, what? Said, it's not a bad idea, maybe. And so a second year came up and the crowd increased again. And the first festival was in 1976. And this year we just celebrated the 28th annual Jazz Festival. And shortly after that, after meeting so many great musicians that came aboard, we introduced another festival called Day of the Drum. And it was the first drum festival in the country that focused on, the idea of that culture was to bring the diversity of Los Angeles together. And we had a meeting with a group of musicians one day, mostly drummers. And Jimmy Solanke from Nigeria said, as we talked about the drum, Jimmy said, it is very, very, very necessary for us to think this way. He said, the drum is the heart, and the heart is always beating. And he said, all of us have our drum. It is the heart. So we say, hey man, let's do the drum festival. And people like Billy Higgins and Tootie Heath, and jumped right in on the Pancho Sanchez, and just all of our great friends, you know. Before you know it, the first drum festival attracted more than 8,000 people. Wow. And so there were Korean drummers, Japanese drummers, drummers from India, from Nigeria, from Ghana, all in Los Angeles already. The universities became involved, you know what I mean? And in marches the police academy, the Philharmonic, Los Angeles Philharmonic one year. They jumped at the idea to participate in the drum festival. All of that is well documented, you know what I mean? And so the drum festival, like the jazz festival, both of them started to attract 8,000 to 10,000 people every year. And Mayor Bradley couldn't wait to get to them sometimes. He would always call up and say, John, who's on the program this year? Let me introduce them. Okay, I'll be out there. You know, he was very enthusiastic himself. And Councilwoman Joan Flores was the councilwoman of the district and also president of city council. She was fond of both of those events because they attracted such an audience. And all the politicians would come out always before all those people, you know, and they had constituency, but they had fun because everybody came and they had a ball all the time.
Is the drum festival still going on?
Oh yeah.
It is.
This year was
the
23rd year of the drum festival. This 23rd annual.
You've been involved in so many of the key happenings in LA and over the years. How have you ever had time to make your own work? Well,
Lyn, I started to look at all of those activities that were affiliated with the whole notion of creative outlook and the vision. I never separated it from my work. And I used to work 16 hours a day sometimes, and I'd go home and work 2 more hours on a piece of art, said to be art, you know what I mean? But what I wrestled with for a long time, and I still wrestle with, is not separating art from the practice of just living, you know, and to say honestly that the most human capacity is that need that all of us have to express in whatever way we express. So it's human to be part of that process. And I think that's what the arts look for always, is the most direct way that we can become human and beyond. Whether you dance, whether you write, whether you sing, whether you paint, you know what I mean? Whether you sit and just think, nurture the process. I think that kind of audacity is capable of speaking to any issue. And this is why the arts are so tangible and so important to community development, individual development, and especially the nurturing of children and the futures and that kind of thing. So I don't see this eliteness as part of the way that I feel about art. I think that this was something very much in progress before civilization was an idea. Thunder is almost symphonic in nature, you know, and the color on the wing of a bird in flight. Like I have a friend who is a painter, and nobody would ever know that she only sees silhouette. She works very detailed. She's a painter, very exciting young lady. And when you go to her studio, a wild bird comes in and says hello to her. A squirrel in her backyard picks an avocado from the tree, one for her, one for him. That's happening right now. And the other day I was at her studio and a blue jay came in, and his name is Blue. And she said, "Hi, Blue, how are you?" You know, and he saw me, and he'd never seen me before, so he couldn't quite trust me. So he jumped back outside of the studio, and the young lady said, "Blue, this is my friend John." Said, "I'm going to give my peanut to him, and you're going to have to take this peanut from him, right?" She gave the peanut to me. The blue jay came to me and took the peanut.
John, is it a recent thing that you work in series of works? And I'm thinking such as Containment or Ethnic Heritage and Ragman. Have you always worked in a series per se, or is this fairly recent?
I've always worked in groups, series, simply because it helps exhaust the thought. There are so many ways that I could express or thoughts that I have as an artist, and one piece doesn't always do it. 10 pieces, in many cases, won't do it, but it will approach my need to exhaust the thinking as related to the physical nature of whatever that thought might be. And so I do series because of that. When I was asked to participate in the Brown versus Board of Education exhibit at the California African American Museum, that exhibit was referred to as Through the Gates, Through the Gates. And it honored the 50th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision made in 1954, integrating the schools that were totally segregated up to that point. So we're still right at the brink of the civil rights era, and I chose to think a little bit about the Plessy versus Ferguson decision that was made almost 100 or so years before that. I think in 1898, when the decision was made to make all public facilities equal but separate. They never were equalized. We all know that, but they separated people from people again. So several years later, the Brown versus Board of Education the Brown versus Board of Education, a decision made by the Supreme Court in 1954, started the process of integrating the schools. And I felt very strongly at the time that I felt that I needed to do this work, that the policies that come down to us, influencing all of us, come from a level above us. And I always think that that level is referred to by me as the big house, the White House, where all the policymakers are. But some of the decisions that have been made throughout the history and legacy of the United States of America have resulted into bad handling of the social order. So that's an outhouse to me, the outer parameter of policy making and policy makers. And I grew up with outhouses in the South, right? They were always outside of the big house. And so that gave me an opportunity to write on the walls of my outhouse with the images of an era, you see. And what we're looking at now is a work that illustrates the energy visually of what happened over a period of time. Some of this far exceeds 1954. Like we go way back to early education and some of the early classrooms when there were no schools actually for black. There are images there. And then we the people, the Constitution and the Articles, some of that language reads so clumsily because it's not true. It's well stated, but it's really not accommodating to what we know as the real history of ourselves. And here we see the flag somewhat on the floor, not out of disrespect for the flag, but a flag that has lost a certain amount of integrity, and at times it won't wave. It is on the floor for the moment as a symbol, as an image, you know what I mean? And the numbers on the outside, if you notice, various times of that decision and the history of education, these numbers represent years that very significant events took place as the educational history advanced. 1954, the Brown versus Board, the Ferguson decision of 1896, and there's some other numbers, I guess, on this side when we look at the year that the Constitution supposedly was written, 1786. An amendment took place in 1787, and so on, you know. Here, the Plessy versus Ferguson, again, that number, or that year, is represented there. This is a piece that was part of a much larger work that I did in Mexico, and it was part of a program called Insight, a collaboration between two countries, the United States and Mexico. And it always takes place every 2 years on the world's busiest border crossing, which is in Tijuana. And I decided that if I could do a piece on the side of Mexico, I'd enjoy doing that. And I worked at El Centro Cultural in the city of Tijuana. And the building that I worked in, or the museum that I worked in, had a glass elevation that went up about 2 stories. And I started inside of that building to construct a wall that moved up to the glass elevation and reflected itself. And then I started on the outside of the glass as if a crash through had taken place, you see. And the outside wall reflected itself. So we're looking at a segment of a wall which was 16 feet long and about 8 feet high. Mm-hmm. right? And I graffitied that wall. If you saw the whole wall, and this is only a segment, like I said, I graffitied that wall with the language in Spanish and English. The message was, the struggle shall continue.
John, thank you very, very, very much for spending all this time with us.
Well, I'm very thankful that you had thought to pay a visit.